It is a Thursday. Bold Republic is on the radio, and because it's a Thursday, we join Wyoming Liberty Group, and Maureen is sitting there smiling at us, the woman who moved down from Canada to get out of the cold. How's that working for you?
Not very well. Not very well. It's warmer where I came from than here. This is ridiculous.
Yeah, well, I got to share something that you just sent me a message on Facebook, and I'm going to go ahead and pop up the photo for everybody to take a look at. So apparently the Wyoming Lottery has just released their logo, and wait, let me move over to the proper photograph here. It looks like this. Okay, for those people watching on camera, there is a jackalope in it. Is that to go with the fantasy of winning?
I guess so. Yeah, I don't know. It actually worked out to be a really good lead into what we're going to talk about today, and that's that, the government, they just do things that end up spending money and wasting money and growing more government. I mean, one of my points when this whole business about having a lottery corporation came up was that, governments, the Wyoming government already generates about $22 million a year on tobacco sales, and it doesn't have a Wyoming Tobacco Corporation. Doesn't need a Wyoming Lottery Corporation either. We wouldn't be spending $165,000 a year on a CEO, wouldn't be spending who knows how much money to develop a ridiculous logo. These agencies have too much power, and their spending ability is just completely out of control.
Now, I'm going to play devil's advocate with you, but I know where the answer is going here. So aren't they supposed to form this corporation for the lotto and then at some point turn it loose and let it run on its own as a separate corporation?
That I don't know. I can't see that. I hadn't heard. No.
Okay. Well, I'd heard that, but when I looked at the way the plans were laid out, I'm thinking, no, it's always going to be on the hook. It always is. Now, I came from Florida. We had implemented a lotto. In fact, when I finally reached the age that I was able to vote, that's when Florida Lottery came up. Now, what was interesting about that, though, was they said the money was going to go to fund education and help supplement what we already had for education funding through taxes. Well, of course, they end up taking the regular education funding and spending it somewhere else. Now Florida schools are only funded through the lottery, and I'm worried about something like that in the state of Wyoming.
Well, if what you mean is that it'll be a commission like the Game and Fish Commission,
right?
Then you can see what's happening there. I mean, not only do they spend way too much, and they need to get general fund funding. Right. Their spending is going up even more this year, and so that's what happens. These things, you get sold in a certain way. For instance, the money will only go to schools, or the money will only go to roads, for instance. And then the next thing oh no, money's also going to recreational trails and snowmobiles and all the rest of it. That's what always happens, and it's just a sign that the government is too big and it's just too completely out of control, and it also is too beholden to special interest groups.
Well, and one more quick example, then I want to go on to what you were saying about some of the trails and game and fish and so on. But here in Gillette, Wyoming, they kept ramming down our throats until they finally did it, something called the Camplex. And when the Camplex was losing money, well, obviously the way to solve the problem of losing so much money, because it's supposed to be a business that makes a profit, but it's obviously not. So here's what we'll do. We'll expand the size of the Camplex, and that will bring in more business. Well, of course, that's not working. So the answer then, Maureen, is let's go ahead and expand the size of the Camplex again, because obviously tripling down on failure will bring in more money. So, of course, that's not working out for us, and it doesn't with anything else. You mentioned, though, hiking trails, things like that. So you're talking about the gasoline tax.
Yeah, a really good intro into this is, how do government agencies feed on taxpayers? Let me count the ways.
Right.
We've talked about game and fish, and we've talked about tourism and the Wyoming Department of Transportation. But one of the things that I started to look at, because there's a fee increase coming up, was the state parks and cultural resources. And when I started looking at that, I realized, and I actually remembered then, yeah, these guys are getting some of the gas tax increase. And when I mentioned that in one of our staff meetings, somebody pointed out that, well, wait a second, wasn't all the gas tax money supposed to go to highways? In fact, it was called the Highway Funding Bill.
Right.
And you had this cabal of special interest groups, some politicians, of course the YDOT bureaucrats, and a whole bunch of special interest groups headed up, ironically, by the Wyoming Taxpayers Association, saying, oh my goodness, yes, the state of Wyoming roads is terrible. We need to have a fuel tax because, of course, that's the only way we could possibly generate enough money to maintain roads from here and into the long term. of course, the entire argument that they made was built entirely on a foundation of myths. One, of course, was that the fuel tax is a long-term source of funding for roads, because you look at government reports. Federal government reports will state quite clearly that because of the fuel efficiency standards that are coming down the road, the amount of fuel that people are using, and therefore the amount of tax that they're paying, is going to be going down and down and down. So, I mean, anybody who takes a look around to see what's happening, electric cars and all the rest of it, will know quite clearly that the amount of fuel consumed is going down. Cars are becoming more efficient, using less fuel, therefore paying a lower fuel tax. So if you truly believe that a fuel tax is a long-term source of funding for roads, then what you're thinking underneath that is that fuel tax is going to go up every single year. So far we haven't seen anything like that this year, and hopefully we won't either. Because, of course, the other big myth was that, Wyoming roads are in such terrible shape. But that's not actually true, because according to one highway report, we had some of the best roads of all our neighboring states, and that was with, at the time, the lowest fuel tax. We had the second lowest fuel tax in the country. Now we're about in the middle. So there is absolutely no evidence at all to show that a high fuel tax translates into good roads. But of course, the most ridiculous myth and this kind of goes to this whole idea that, well, if we have a lottery, then we'll pay for schools. Well, if you have a fuel tax, that you're not actually going to be paying that fuel tax. Because keep in mind that 52% of the people who drive and buy gasoline in Wyoming are from out of state, so that means they're going to pay it. And there was something other. Oh yeah, and of course the service stations are going to absorb that cost. Well, service stations these days, gasoline for them is a loss leader. You'll notice that a lot of service stations have got restaurants or corner store kind of setups. Well, that's because that's where they make their money, and they get people in to buy fuel. It's a loss leader, and they generate income in other ways. So this whole idea, I mean, the whole rationale for the fuel tax was just based on a bunch of myths. And of course the worst one was, well, all the fuel tax is going to go to roads. And I do recall at the time reading that, well, no, some is in fact going to go to recreational trails, but I didn't really put two and two together and realize just how completely outrageous that was until I started looking at state parks and cultural resources.
Okay, now let's pause for a minute here. I know that state of Wyoming has something in it that when they write a law, there's got to be a paragraph at the top that explains what the law is. And if you can't do it simply, you can't have the law. In other words, that prevents us, like other states and even the federal government, from people constantly adding on to the law. They love to put little attachments to it.
Oh, sure.
Supposed to be immune from that in the state of Wyoming. So how then did we go from the promise of this is going to go just to roads to all of these special interests getting their hands into the pot? How are those attachments to the bill, or how does this work?
Well, no. If you look at the digest for the it was HB 62 last year, I think it was. If you look at so if you go to the Legislative Service Office website, you can go back into the list of bills, and in there's something called a digest. And what the digest does is show how things have been amended through the process. And originally, the money was just going to go to roads, and then somebody, I forget who exactly it was, said, "Oh yeah, don't forget, the trails need some money too." Oh yeah, and so away we went, because I actually got quite an irate email from who I call Mr. Taxman, Representative Mike Madden.
Oh, so wait, a guy you're calling Mr. Taxman is irate with you. Go figure. Okay, go on.
He said he was actually quite upset with the article that I had published on this. Yeah. And he said, the Constitution assures that all road fuel taxes must be used to construct and maintain roads, but not all fuel taxes purchased by road users, and therefore there need to be a bunch of exemptions to this law.
Right.
And that's where that sort of comes from. And as far as I'm concerned, his whole long email explaining all the different groups that get special treatment because, they don't necessarily use gasoline on roads, I said to him, what that really is an argument for a lower, simpler, and flatter tax system. So instead of having a high tax with all kinds of exemptions, you've got a very, very low tax with no exemptions. And right in his email, he said, you can imagine how onerous this is for YDOT to administer. Yeah, it costs money. So why don't we just cut this thing and cut all the exemptions as well? Gee.
Well, I got some people, I know you're going to think, gee, Glenn, you didn't get somebody upset with your big mouth, but no, the people of Wright, Wyoming are all mad at me, and I don't think that I'm even allowed to slow down when I go through that town anymore. I was upset, and I was actually not picking on the people of Wright, which I actually do like that little town, but WYDOT decided to go ahead and put in there $1 million visitor center. You ever been through Wright? You know what Wright looks like. If you blink, you miss it. And so are we also looking at projects like that, which are supposed to be for beautification and tourism to help the economy? We're looking at using those kinds of excuses, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just right here in Cheyenne, a few miles down the road towards Denver, they built this very nice visitor center.
Yeah.
And I wrote in one of my articles, I was writing about the tourism department, and in there I've got some stats in there about how tourism spending is going down. So what does the tourism department do? Well, this is something we talked about just a few minutes ago. You've got something, it makes no money, so what does government do? Well, it does more of it. So they've got all these visitor centers. Nobody really goes there. They're certainly not self-supporting. So what does the government do? Well, it builds more of them.
Well, sure, and real quick on that note, we got to get more onto the topic. I've told you before, I grew up basically in Margaritaville in Florida, and my family's business was tourism. We rented out cottages on this cute little island called Captiva to the tourists, and we had visitor center there. Well, when I was a little kid, I knew back then that visitor centers didn't do us a whole lot of good. Now people are using cell phones more than anything else, rather than stopping, unless it's to use the bathroom real quick, which the state could have actually made some tax money off of bathrooms if they had people pull over into convenience stores rather than a tourist shop where they don't have to buy anything. They just walk in, grab some brochures, and out the door they go. So if they want to do anything, really, they would encourage private companies to open up businesses along, and rest stops and so on along our busy interstate systems, rather than Wright, Wyoming, in the visitor center. The one on the South Dakota border, by the way, Maureen, if you haven't seen that, it looks like a museum. I mean, it's massive. The new visitor center there, and the thing looks like a museum. Okay, so is there any way to fund highways in Wyoming that would work for you, since you don't like the ideas that the state has put forward so far?
Well, the issue with highways is that we've got a situation now that's a result of massive amount of government spending, and can only be, as usual, supported by massive amounts of future government spending. So one of my friends, who's a university professor down at Loyola University in New Orleans, in fact, has written an entire book on road and highway privatization. And he's somebody who you might want to have on the show sometime, who could speak to that in a much more informed way than I can. But I think ultimately, people don't want to pay tolls. People don't want to pay fuel tax. People are paying less in fuel tax. There's a whole idea out there now to put GPS on your car and send you bills that way. I mean, with the NSA and the IRS and all the rest of it, the last thing we want to have is the government knowing where we're driving. So I think at the end of the day, ultimately, what we're going to have to move towards is road privatization.
That is going to be a big pill for the government to swallow. I mean,
think of the power they would lose.
Yeah. Huh? Well, there's the thing. It's not so much the money. I think you just nailed it there. It's not so much the money that they would lose. It's the power that they would lose.
Because that's what this is all about at the end of the day.
Let's talk more about this with Maureen in just a moment. And speaking of phones, I think we might actually have a call for you, Maureen. If this guy was able to hang on through the break. This is Glenn. Who's on the phone?
Hi, Glenn. This is John.
Yes,
Hello,
sir.
Maureen.
Hi, John.
Maureen, maybe you can clear this up for me. But I remember when I was a kid, the government would put pressure on us by using highway funds and such to do what they wanted. The one thing was when they raised the drinking age, and they kept talking about doing other things, and they hold this stuff over us. What happened to that minerals royalty tax that we were supposed to get back to do our roads and stuff like that? And I'll jump off so you can answer that.
All right, interesting question. Yeah, could we just pay this through our mineral tax and so on, Maureen?
Well, John has actually made a very good point, and this is something here at the Liberty Group we're spending quite a bit of time on right now, and that's how can we free ourselves from all of the strings that are attached to federal funding. Now, of course, the way you do that is by rejecting federal funding. And there might even be a bill coming up in the session, this upcoming session, where we will just reject all the federal funding for the free and reduced lunch program. So what that would do is allow Wyoming and Wyoming schools to decide what those lunches are going to be and how much the kids can eat, instead of what the federal government is deciding. And the reason that what the legislator that I spoke to is wanting to bring that is because he went to a school and he said to the kids, if you have any questions you want to ask, go ahead and ask. He doesn't pre-screen his questions. He wants real, honest, open dialogue with these kids. And one of the kids said, well, how come I'm hungry at the end of each lunch period? And he couldn't understand it, and he asked about it, and he said, well, we have to throw all this food away. He said, well, why are you throwing food away if these kids are still hungry? Oh, well, it's the federal program, it's the federal rules, and this and that. And so the same sort of thing goes, the same problem comes anytime we take federal funding for anything. And in fact, John had another point he was going to make about we did actually end up getting some money back from the government. I think it was the money that was sequestered, but I can't remember exactly what happened with that. So some of the money that we didn't get from the federal government that we were supposed to, we did get. It's all sort of a bit complicated. But one of the things that's interesting about in what we're going to talk about today, although we're running out of time, is that this whole trail spending. So the State Parks and Cultural Resources gets $1.1 million every biennium currently in the gas tax. It's going to get an additional about $822,000. So it's going to have like $1.9 million or almost $2 million to spend grooming snowmobile trails from the fuel tax alone. Now, I'm not even talking about the additional fuel tax. It's almost the same amount that they get for the off-road vehicle trails. It's really quite unbelievable how much money from the tax goes to groom trails.
Well, you were talking about privatization a while ago. One of my favorite groups that I watch, it's part of my homework every Sunday. I go catch up with the Reason Foundation, Reason TV, Reason Magazine, and they have showed that across the country, more and more states, Arizona and Nevada are two of them, which will privatize parks. And privatizing parks allows companies to go in and work a park for profit. And they actually do a better job at a cheaper price. Now, what this means, and this is where some people get upset at first, is if you want to use a snowmobile trail, well, you're going to have to pay a private company that maintains the snowmobile trail. They're going to charge you at the gate to get in and use it. Some people may get upset at first, but in the long run, you're only charging the people who use the trails, and they often wind up better maintained than the government ever maintained them.
Yeah, you're right. And in a lot of public parks now, and I mean even in Canada, they're starting to charge, because I mean this costs money. You can't expect the general taxpayer, to pick up the entire bill. People who use things have I mean, most people are really willing to pay for what they use. But I think what happens over time is that the government creates this sense of entitlement. And certainly with the snowmobile trails and off-road trails, you get that feeling as well. Because not only are you spending about $3.6 million per biennium to groom 2,000 miles of snowmobile trails for like $1,800 a biennium, you've got they're the same trails that are being used off-road. And so what you've got then is a bureaucracy that's costing more and more and more money every single biennium. Because why? We're looking at a 2% increase in salary over the next 2 years. We're looking at a higher taxpayer-funded pension contribution. Healthcare costs are going up. If you had the Snowmobile Association, for instance, managing that land in a very similar way to the way that, and leasing it from the government in a similar way that the oil and gas companies do, then what they could do to groom those trails is, instead of hiring bureaucrats at huge salaries and massive benefits, you could hire college students who could come. They work through the season. They go back to college. You don't have to pay them too much. Maybe you can give them like free use of the trails or something, which is something a lot of these kids would really prefer. And instead of creating a massive bureaucracy that gets bigger and bigger every single year, as we see in so many of these different bureaucracies.
Well, about a minute left. A lot of people I have the discussion with, it's hard to wean them off this idea. If it's coming through tax dollars, they say, well, the trails are free. It's tough, Maureen, to convince people, no, you're actually paying more than if you paid at the gate. That's the argument I think we have to make to the general public.
Well, that's, all you need to do is look at healthcare in Canada. Healthcare in Canada, oh, it's free. No, it's not. It's about 60% of a provincial budget, and it goes up by 6% every single year. That means that in about 20 years from now, it's going to be virtually 100% of the budget. So it's not free. It means that you're crowding out you're spending scarce tax dollars, crowding out other spending. This kind of taxpayer abuse has just got to stop.
Maureen, always good to talk to you.
Great talking to you too.
All right, bye.
See ya.